Jeremy Love. I'm a board member of New Hampshire Peace Action, and I'll be facilitating this evening's program. In case you are new to New Hampshire Peace Action, our mission is to contribute to creating a world in which nuclear disarmament, mutual security, global understanding, international cooperation, and respect for human rights create social, economic, and environmental benefits for all. If you enjoy the series and are participating through YouTube or Facebook, we'd appreciate it if you'd click the like or subscribe button and turn on post notifications so you'd be able to see new material when it comes along. YouTube will also provide us with a custom URL if we're able to get up to 50 subscribers. So even for our live Zoom participants here tonight, looking us up and subscribing on YouTube would be really helpful. You can find our YouTube channel by going to newhampshirepeaceaction.org and looking for the live tab, and there you can catch up on conversations you might have missed. We think that upheavals experienced in 2020 have brought us to a new moment of reckoning and possibility. This bi-weekly online conversation series is intended to help us engage and sort out how to make the changes for which we strive. Tonight, we bring you Peace and Justice Conversations, the impact of American exceptionalism on culture and policy, a talk with Professor Eric Cheyfitz. Our plans for about a 40-minute presentation followed by hopefully a lively Q&A discussion. A bit on Zoom etiquette real quick. We're happy to have you keep your video on so we can see your faces and reactions and feel connected here. We ask that you keep your audio muted if you're not talking. The chat's a great place for you to share reactions, and as we are planning for a vibrant Q&A discussion, I ask that you please submit your questions in the chat interface, and we'll do our best to get as many as we can. So now let me introduce you to tonight's program. American exceptionalism is defined differently depending upon who you ask. Dartmouth professor Donald Pease defines American exceptionalism as the lasting belief in America as the fulfillment of the national ideal to which other nations aspire. In my research of this topic, the common thread across the varying definitions and understandings is that the United States is unique in the history of nation states as an exemplar or even superior to in terms of its implementation of democratic systems of government based upon the principles of liberty, individualism, and property rights. But this begs the question, is the United States truly an exemplar or superior in those terms, or are these simply myths that Americans tell themselves, ignoring, excusing, or apologizing away more than 500 years of documented history, which happen to tell a much different story? To dig deeper into the topic of American exceptionalism and how it impacts culture and policy, we have with us tonight Professor Eric Cheyfitz. Eric is the Ernest I. White Professor of American Studies and Humane Letters at Cornell University and is also a faculty member of the American Indian and Indigenous Studies program. He served as the director of that program, a faculty coordinator of the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program, and the director of the Mellon Postdoctoral Diversity Seminar. His scholarship and teaching focus on the force of settler colonialism on indigenous peoples and their ongoing resistance in the form of alternative ways of thought and action to the predatory capitalism embedded in the settler existence. His most recent book is The Disinformation Age, The Collapse of Liberal Democracy in the United States, which in its final chapter, Thinking from a Different Place, What is a Just Society, offers, beyond the limits of capitalism's imagination, an indigenous alternative to the way out of the current crisis of climate collapse and wealth inequality. Professor, the floor is now yours.
Okay, thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for having me, and I welcome everybody and appreciate your tuning in. We've been living on Zoom for a long time, and hopefully that'll come to an end. I prefer sort of in-person contact. I'm going to read some stuff first that comes sort of amalgamation from the second chapter of my book that Jeremy just mentioned, The Disinformation Age, Collapse of Liberal Democracy in the United States, and with some added stuff. A little time has gone by since that book was published. The paperback edition is an expanded edition that came out in 2019. So let me start. As I understand it, American exceptionalism is made up of two myths, one domestic, the other foreign. The domestic myth is the American dream of a classless society, the promise that if one works hard, one can achieve the good life, which includes a living wage, home ownership, college for the kids, regular vacations, and a secure retirement. In an article titled Socioeconomic Mobility in the United States, Wikipedia notes, Quote, many Americans strongly believe the US is a land of opportunity that offers every child an equal chance at social and economic mobility. The American rise from humble origin to riches has been called a civil religion, the bedrock upon which the American story has been anchored and part of the American identity. That's the quote from Wikipedia. Over the last 40 years, this narrative, with the rise of wage and income inequality across 6 presidencies, cannot reconcile itself with the facts on the ground, where the promise of a middle-class life has disappeared for the majority of Americans who are living in debt with little savings. 86% of the wealth in this country is in the top 20% of the population. The foreign myth is that the United States is not like other European powers, an imperial state. The myth is that having freed ourselves from British colonialism, the US set out to spread democracy around the globe under the God-blessed auspices of manifest destiny, the secular offspring of the Puritan errand in the wilderness, as Perry Miller called it. The fact is that the US was founded and developed through settler colonialism, the theft of Indian lands through genocide, and the theft of African labor to work those lands. As Patrick Wolf defines it in his generative essay, Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, which I recommend, settler colonialism is not an event, something in the past, but a structure, something still determinative of the state's socioeconomic conditions. One has only to study US foreign policy in Latin America, for example, to see our support for right-wing governments over and against popular revolutions from the left, the goal of which has been redistribution of resources to end endemic poverty in those revolutions: Cuba, Chile, Venezuela, Bolivia, Ecuador, Brazil, and various states of disrepair or repair. Bolivia is coming back now after elections. Cuba is still strong. Chile, of course. Brazil is a right-wing dictatorship under Bolsonaro. So one needs to watch Latin America for those developments. But the US has uniformly supported right-wing takeovers. In a New York Times article of November 5th, 2011, former President Bill Clinton is quoted as saying, in reference to President Obama's incipient re-election campaign, quote, "I'm really trying to help him, but he seems to have lost his narrative," end of quote. The nation, which is an ideological formation, is precisely a narrative, in distinction from the state, which, following the French philosopher who I quote extensively, Louis Althusser, quote, contains the government, the administration, the army, the police, the courts, the prisons, etc., which constitute for Althusser the repressive state apparatus. So you have, on the one hand, a narrative rationalizing the state, and you have the state, okay, with these engines of governance. Like Obama, we might say the nation has lost its narrative, leaving only the state in its place, which is trying to dissimulate this loss by deploying a failed narrative, the narrative of American exceptionalism. Disinformation marks this loss and its dissimulation. As the economist Raghuram G. Rajan notes, quote, "Many have lost faith in the narrative of America as a land of unbounded opportunity, which in the past created the public support that made the United States a bastion of economic freedom," end of quote. I would only modify Rajan thusly: economic freedom for some and economic constraints for the many. As noted, this lost narrative typically goes under the name of American exceptionalism. The term itself, as David Levering Lewis points out, though not the idea, quote, is of relatively recent vintage from its origins in the mid-1930s as high-flown political science theory to its appropriation during the Cold War as ideological boilerplate. American exceptionalism became the ready cliche of politicians, public intellectuals, journalists, and media opinion molders after Reagan's 1980 election, end of quote. But the loss of the narrative does not mean that it is no longer being wielded. It simply means that as disinformation, the narrative no longer has a referent in social actuality. So, for example, in his 2012 State of the Union address, President Obama proclaimed, "Yes, The world is changing. No, we can't control every event, but America remains the one indispensable nation in world affairs. And as long as I'm president, I intend to keep it that way. End of quote. The term indispensable both evokes the exceptionalist narrative with its emphasis on the imagined historic uniqueness of America, which is actually the mythic projection of the United States, because we live in the Americas. We are not the only America, although that's the claim, the implicit claim. And it simultaneously declares the illusory stature of that narrative as hyperbole. In what sense is the United States, or for that matter, any nation, qua nation, indispensable? Consciously or simply reflexively, Obama is trying to evoke in this statement the formative period of the American exceptionalist narrative, the period of revolution and its immediate aftermath. At that moment, a few months prior to the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Paine wrote in his best-selling pamphlet, Common Sense, quote, "We have it in our power to begin the world over again. The birthday of a new world is at hand," end of quote. At the moment they were published, these words translated into actual force had an actual, if simultaneously fabulous referent, because the American Revolution was the vanguard of Western democratic revolutions to come. As Paine would write in 1792, in the wake of the beginning of the French Revolution, quote, "From a small spark kindled in America, a flame has arisen not to be extinguished." And so America does inaugurate the age of democratic revolutions in the 19th century. These words of Paine's and their force are echoed in Thomas Jefferson's first inaugural address delivered on the 4th of March, 1801, where the president references the US government as the world's best hope. That's a quote. But what force does this exceptionalist rhetoric have today in the US when vanguard revolutionary action and ideas, though certainly influenced by the revolutionary era of the US, are for the most part elsewhere? They appear in the Chavez Bolivarian revolution in Venezuela, however threatened it is from the right, which since Chavez's death in 2013 has been taking advantage of a growing economic crisis under the presidency of Nicolas Maduro, a crisis inaugurated by the fall of oil prices and exacerbated by US trade sanctions. The crisis reached a tipping point with the attempted coup against the government of Maduro by the right-wing forces backing Juan Guaido, the leader of the National Assembly, with US support. The irony here is that Simón Bolívar, the 19th century inspiration for Latin American revolutions of liberation, is known popularly as the George Washington of South America. These revolutionary forces were in evidence in the movement of the Workers' Party in Brazil, though its leader, Luiz Inácio da Silva, Lula, popularly known, made compromises with neoliberalism, hard if not impossible to avoid for nation states, which must operate in the global market. His successor, Dilma Rousseff, was impeached in 2016 by the right-wing opposition. This impeachment has been called a coup. In the wake of Dilma's impeachment and the imprisonment of Lula, both on widely contested right-wing charges of corruption, Brazil in 2018 elected Jair Bolsonaro, a far-right candidate president who with a neoliberal agenda is clearing the Amazon and its indigenous peoples for corporate profit. With the result, among others, that the largest carbon sink in the world, the source of the air we breathe, is being destroyed. If, as of 2019, the recent left-wing tide in Latin America is moving right again, we should remember that the energies of indigenous movements in Bolivia, Ecuador, and Chiapas, Mexico, and the working class and peasant power that, along with indigenous forces, fuels the left in Latin America, is alive and historically resistant to the continuation of colonialism in its present guise as neoliberal capitalism. Beyond Latin America, but in conjunction with its forces, we should keep in mind the Arab Spring, the Occupy Wall Street movement here at home, suppressed by local governments, suspension of First Amendment rights to freedom of assembly, and we should remember as well the indigenous DAPL, Dakota Access Pipeline resistance to an intracontinental oil pipeline on the Standing Rock Sioux lands in North Dakota. thwarted by a combination of corporate and government power. These US movements need to be understood within the context of their immediate foreign precedents, which should include the native Idle No More movement against fossil fuels in Canada. Their liberatory energies persist, though in the Middle East, these struggles, the Arab Spring clearly has been suppressed for the moment. That's quite clear. And of course, we have in Israel an apartheid state where Palestinian resistance is brutally contained. In the beginning of that time, the revolutionary moment in the United States, defending the Constitution against anti-federalist criticism in a public meeting in Philadelphia on October 6, 1787, James Wilson called it the best form of government which has ever been offered to the world. As if in response to that assertion from across over 2 centuries, in the February 6, 2012 online edition of the New York Times, there appeared a story entitled, "We the People Loses Appeal with People Around the World," the implications of which for the exceptionalist narrative are clear enough. And here I quote from the article at length. In 1987, on the Constitution's bicentennial, Time magazine calculated that of the 170 countries that exist today, more than 160 have written charters modeled directly or indirectly on the US version. That was in 1987. A quarter century later, the picture looks very different. Quote, "The US Constitution appears to be losing its appeal as a model for constitutional drafters elsewhere," according to a new study by David S. Law of Washington University in St. Louis and Mila Versteeg of the University of Virginia. The study, to be published in June, so it's already been published, in the New York University Law Review, bristles with data. Its authors coded and analyzed, I'm still quoting from the Times article, the provisions of 729 constitutions adopted by 188 countries from 1946 to 2006, and they considered 237 variables regarding various rights and ways to enforce them. Among the world's democracies, Professor Lon Versteeg concluded, constitutional similarity to the United States has clearly gone into free fall. Over the 1960s and 1970s, democratic institutions as a whole became more similar to the US Constitution, only to reverse course in the 1980s and 1990s. End of quote. And then the final snippet from the article. The turn of the 21st century, however, saw the beginning of a steep plunge that continues through the most recent years for which we have data, to the point that the constitution of the world's democracies are on average less similar to the US Constitution now than they were at the end of World War II, end of quote. In the same article, former Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg is quoted from an interview on Egyptian television. And I read the quote, "I would not look to the United States Constitution if I were drafting a constitution in the year 2012. Okay, a remarkable statement coming from a Supreme Court justice. She recommended instead the South African Constitution, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, or the European Convention on Human Rights. And I would recommend the Bolivian Constitution myself, which is quite an incredible document. Meanwhile, while Obama insisted in his 2012 State of the Union address, in which he did not mention the word poverty once, that, quote, "America is back. Anyone who tells you otherwise, anyone who tells you that America is in decline or that our influence has waned doesn't know what they're talking about." He means people like me. "The actual state of the union in which," and that's a quote, the end of the quote, "then the actual state of the union in which half of the country is living just above, at, or below the poverty line is desperate. If one wasn't aware of this situation before last March, the social and economic disruptions caused by the Trump administration mishandling of the COVID-19 pandemic has made this situation, the rise of wealth and income inequality through the last 6 presidencies, manifest." Excuse me for a second, I'm just want to blow my nose. Thank you. Okay, so I think, again, if you weren't aware of what's been going on through the 6 presidencies from Reagan forward, the COVID situation with its huge unemployment, loss of houses, evictions, et cetera, not to mention close to 500,000 deaths, will make the situation in this country, or should make it manifest, unless you're asleep at the wheel. In this sense, the United States is quite unexceptional. In a world where the words of the Martinician revolutionary Frantz Fanon strike the right chord. And I quote from Fanon, and I quote this quote often in what I do. What matters today, the issue which blocks the horizon, is the necessity for a redistribution of wealth. Humanity must respond to this question or be shaken to pieces by it. And I think it's being shaken to pieces. Whereas in its call, end of that quote, whereas in its call for democratic political forms, the narrative of American exceptionalism was on the cutting edge of history in 1776 and 1787, its use today finds it utterly out of touch with history in a world that no longer looks toward in a world that no longer looks toward but past it to other narratives in order to imagine new forms of democracy, particularly those that envision forms of economic justice, which is what the Bolivian Constitution is about. That and the Ecuadorian Constitution also recognize the rights of nature as human rights. And I think this is also an important turn, not as commodities, but as living entities, which comes out of an indigenous philosophy. Paine's commitment to the narrative of American exceptionalism, of which he is one of the authors, combined with the demographics of the United States at the end of the 18th century, permits him to focus on Europe as the site of poverty and wretchedness, which he does. But even at that formative moment, and poverty is no stranger to the shores of the United States, and with the steady increase of population, combined with the rise of industrialization, urbanization, it will become all too familiar. In The Shadow of the Poorhouse, an historian of United States poverty, Michael B. Katz, writes, and I quote, "Myths of abundance in early American history notwithstanding, poverty was a serious and growing problem. Indeed, no clear line separated ordinary working people from those in need of help, because periodic destitution was one structural result of the great social and economic transformations in American life." End of quote. Writing his book, Democracy in America, in the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville, even while advertising the equality of condition he thought he found in the US, remarked on an emerging aristocracy of manufacturers and the poor who worked for them. And I quote from Tocqueville, "The small aristocratic societies that are formed by some manufacturers in the midst of the immense democracy of our age contain, like the great aristocratic societies of former ages, some men who are very opulent and a multitude who are wretchedly poor. The poor have few means of escaping from the conditions of their condition and becoming rich." So even there, Tocqueville, who in one sense promoted the myth of upward mobility in the United States, completely criticizes it. These contradictions, I think, are rampant in his work, which is an important book and should be read. But I think one needs to tune into precisely the sort of contradictions that occur, and I think he's conscious of those contradictions. When in the second treatise of government, John Locke famously wrote, "Thus in the beginning, the world was America," he envisioned a world before money enabled a new and pervasive system for the unequal distribution of property, a world perpetually in the state of nature, where there was no scarcity and resources were imagined as unbounded. It is a world implicitly evoked in the language from Rajan cited at the beginning of this talk, and I quote it again. "Many have lost faith in the narrative of America as a land of unbounded opportunity, which in the past created the public support that made the United States a bastion of economic freedom." End of quote. Okay. And as you remember, I qualified his bastion of economic freedom to have its limits for obvious reasons. And Tocqueville's quote backs that up. The key word in the quote is unbounded in the narrative of American exceptionalism. America is infinite in terms of space and material and imaginative resources, this notion of America. It is this infinitude, or rather the public sense of it, that imagined America as exceptional, precisely a sort of mythic notion. There is, however, a tension in Rajan's statement between faith, having faith in this myth or this ideology, and experience, constitutive of the exceptionalist narrative, which cannot survive experience alone. For experience is always partial. The United States was clearly never, quote, a bastion of economic freedom for all of its people, past and present, while faith implies the promise, not the reality, of universality. What sustained this faith until the present moment was the promise of an ever-expanding middle class that would finally include all of those cut off from it by the historic barriers of race, gender, and class. But with the disappearance of the middle class, or at the very least with a recognition that its boundaries are rapidly contracting rather than expanding, the tension between faith and experience, which sustained the exceptionalist narrative, has effectively collapsed. That is, the negative experience represented by the statistics of inequality has undermined the faith in the narrative. At least that is what current surveys suggest. Less and less people believe any longer in the American dream. The primary sign of the disappeared or rapidly contracting middle class, I call them a ghost elsewhere when they get evoked, is the massive increase in income inequality over the last 30 years. Rajan notes this inequality, and I quote from him, "And the political pressure it has created for easy credit," that's Rajan. "Clearly, the highly visible incomes at the very top have gone up. The top 1% of households accounted for only 8.9% of income in 1976, but this share grew to 23.5% of the total income generated in the United States in 2007, and it's on the rise. Put differently, of every dollar of real income growth that was generated between 1976 and 2007, 58 cents went to the top 1% of households. In 2007, the hedge fund manager, John Paulson, earned $3.7 billion, about 74,000 times the median household income in the United States. What needs emphasizing here is the way that the instability of easy credit displaces the stability of a fair distribution of income, which is necessary to maintain the middle class and allows for its expansion. Okay, and this is a really important notion. I may skip through some of this, but essentially what starts to happen is people hallucinate credit as income. Okay, they borrow off their houses, they borrow from this. Credit cards are just maxed out. We live in a country of debt. That's the fact. But it hallucinates as income, and then when the debts come due, people don't have the money to pay them off, and we get what we got in 2008. We get a crash in the economy. And this is coming again. We have student debt that's over $1 trillion, over $1.5 trillion at this point. And if you're not in the top 20%, where 86% of the wealth is, you're living in debt occasionally. And I think one of the things that needs to be understood about Donald Trump is Trump was a great con man. He played on public angst and anxiety about living on the edge, and a real deep unhappiness and bitterness about the fact that America was not delivering on the American dream. And he conned people because he did not, in fact, represent any populist movement to the left and to redistribution. He represented precisely the opposite. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, certainly to some important degree represented that populist movement to the left, and the Democratic Party undermined both of them. for a sort of centrist corporate agenda, which has been their agenda traditionally, and which has not solved the problems of deep poverty, of alienation, not to mention the environmental issues that we have. So that I think is an extremely important perception that Rajan makes about the relationship of debt to income. Debt is hallucinated income. That's how I talk about it in the book. Unfortunately, it is hallucinated, and when it comes due, you don't have the income to pay it off. And thereby, I think, lies a deep, deep, deep alienation in the American public. So I'm going to, I think, just skip over a couple of things here I covered at greater length in what I just said. Okay, so let me move on then. The foundation of the exceptionalist narrative is the figure of the American dream. And the foundation of the dream is home ownership, which is going down dramatically. Rajan quotes President Bill Clinton in 1995. Here's the quote from Clinton. "This past year, I directed HUD Secretary Henry G. Cisneros to develop a plan to boost home ownership in America to an all-time high by the end of this century. Expanding home ownership will strengthen our nation's families and communities, strengthen our economy, and expand this country's great middle class. Rekindling the dream of home ownership for America's working families can prepare our nation to embrace the rich possibilities of the 21st century." So Clinton should be made to eat those words, indeed. Both Clinton's rhetoric and his policy were carried forward by the George W. Bush administration. Rajan quotes two of Bush's public statements made in 2004 and 2002, which, like the Clinton rhetoric, are deeply embedded in exceptionalist ideology. Here's the quote from Bush. "If you own something, you have a vital stake in the future of our country. The more ownership there is in America, the more vitality there is in America, and the more people have a vital stake in the future of this country. I believe owning something is a part of the American dream. I believe when somebody owns their own home, they're realizing the American dream." So according to this and according to what's happened to home ownership, the American dream has disappeared, essentially. We might suppose then that when home foreclosures reach a critical mass, accompanied by chronic joblessness, and I, along with numerous other commentators, am arguing that that mass has been reached, the American dream and the exceptionalist narrative it constitutes are themselves foreclosed. At this moment of foreclosure, American exceptionalism shifts from ideology to what I call disinformation, which is the detachment of rhetoric from reality, even though that rhetoric persists. And it does so with tremendous destructiveness to trying to figure out how to deal with the problems that are being presented to the United States of America today. In a New York Times op-ed essay dated October 28, 2011, Charles M. Blow puts it succinctly: "We are slowly and painfully being forced to realize that we are no longer the America of our imaginations," Blow continues. It's a great quote. Here's Blow, some more Blow. "We sold ourselves a pipe dream that everyone could get rich and no one would get hurt. A pipe dream that exploded like a pipe bomb when the already rich grabbed for all the gold, when they used their fortunes to influence government and gain favors and protection, when everyone else was left to scrounge around their ankles in hopes that a few coins would fall. We have not taken care of the least among us. We have allowed a revolting level of income inequality to develop. We have watched as millions of our fellow countrymen have fallen into poverty, and we have done a poor job of educating our children and now threaten to leave them a country that is a shell of its former self. We should be ashamed. Poor policies and poor choices have led to exceedingly poor outcomes. Our societal chickens have come home to roost," to paraphrase and quote Malcolm X in a different context. That's Charles Blow. I think that's a great, very, very succinct statement of the situation. To support his lament, and I would suggest a possible pun on his adjective revolting, Blow points as an addendum to his essay report by the Bertelsmann Stiftung Foundation of Germany, which, quote, analyzed some metrics of basic fairness and equality among organizations for economic cooperation and development countries, the OECD, and ranked America among the ones at the bottom in terms of quality of life standards. This is over 30 countries. Okay. Among the ones at the bottom. The categories rated were social justice, poverty prevention, poverty rate, child poverty rate, senior citizen poverty rate, income inequality, public expenditure of pre-primary education as a percentage of GDP, health, and intergenerational justice rating, which includes family and pension policies, environmental policies, and assessment of political economic being established for future generations. Of the 31 countries rated from Eastern and Western Europe, North and South America, Asia, and the Pacific Rim, the United States ranked 27th. These statistics necessarily contradict one of American exceptionalism's formative documents, the Revolutionary Declaration of Independence, with its assertion that, quote, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, end of quote. It would seem to be no accident that in this generative statement of self-evident truths, the Declaration juxtaposes, without precisely equating equality and rights, to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The question begged here is, how does one achieve these rights without the institution of specific social mechanisms for ensuring economic justice? Okay, I'm near the end. Franklin Roosevelt expressed this necessity in his State of the Union speech to Congress on January 11th, 1944, as World War II moved towards its denouement. Along with concerns of national mobilization to win the war as quickly as possible, the focus of Roosevelt's message at its beginning and end is the need for future national security. Put that in quotes. Quote, not only physical security, which provides safety from attacks by aggressors, but also economic security, social security, moral security in a family of nations, end of quote. As he continues, Roosevelt evokes a vision of lasting peace and prosperity, a central tenet of American exceptionalism. And here's the quote again from Roosevelt. All our allies have learned by bitter experience that real development will not be possible if they are to be diverted from their purpose by repeated wars or even threats of war. And we're living in a state of endless war at this point. Real development, Roosevelt says, then is contingent on peace, and a, quote, basic essential to peace is a decent standard of living for all individual men and women and children in all nations. Freedom from fear is eternally linked with freedom from want. End of quote. Thus evoking the language of both the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence, the president at the end of his speech enjoins the nation to begin to lay the groundwork for a lasting peace. And I quote here from Roosevelt at the end, the last couple of pages here. It is our duty now to begin to lay the plans and determine the strategy for the winning of a lasting peace and the establishment of an American standard of living higher than ever before known. We cannot be content, no matter how high that general standard of living may be, if some fraction of our people, whether it be 1/3 or 1/5 or 1/10, how about 80%, is ill-fed, ill-clothed, ill-housed, and insecure. This republic, Roosevelt goes on, had its beginning and grew to its present strength under the protection of certain inalienable political rights, among them the right of free speech, free press, free worship, trial by jury, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. They were our rights to liberty, to life and liberty. And he goes on, as our nation has grown in size and stature, however, as our industrial economy expanded, these political rights provided inadequate to assure us equality in the pursuit of happiness. We have come to a clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. And then this is the great quote: necessitous men are not free men. Necessitous men are not free men. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. And we certainly started to see some of that in the Trump era, but I would say before that. A dictatorship of oligarchy, not of a single person, which I think we are living in right now, whether it's Biden, or whether it's Trump, whether it's Obama, or whether it's Reagan. Roosevelt goes on, in our days, these economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. We have accepted, so to speak, a second Bill of Rights under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station, race, or creed. And then he goes through and he lists these rights: the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation, the right of every farmer to raise and sell his products at a return which will give him and his family a decent living. And he didn't see, or maybe he did, the swallowing up of family farming by factory farming. The right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad, hence Amazon. The right of every family to a decent home. The right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. The right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment. And most people in this country do not have any kind of adequate savings for their retirement. They're dependent on Social Security, which the less you make during your lifetime, the less you get when you retire. The right to a good education. Okay, college has gone off the map in terms of its cost. Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren recommended free college. They have it in Germany. All of these rights spell security. And after this war is won, we must be prepared to move forward in the implementation of these rights to new goals of human happiness and well-being. And here's the final short paragraph. That's the end of Roosevelt. The unfortunate fact is that the two parties have not moved forward to the implementation of these rights, but retreated with increasing speed from them, while still spouting the rhetoric of American exceptionalism and the American dream. American rhetoric is now totally detached from American reality. The US exists in a state of disinformation. Thank you.
Wow, thanks so much for that, Professor Cheyfitz. We're going to open this up for the Q&A part of our event this evening. And as sort of the facilitator, I've got kind of one lined up for you. So many in Washington espouse a viewpoint that American leadership in the world and military intervention is, or at least is intended to be, a force for good. And therefore, full spectrum dominance is used as a strategy to gain and maintain global hegemony. How would you engage congressional staffers and others who begin their thinking with that perspective?
Well, let's look at the wars. First of all, the support, for example, in Yemen, the poorest country in the world, and the battering and further impoverishment and deaths of those people. It's in effect a genocide. We've been supporting Saudi Arabia. We're about to, I think, withdraw from that. But we've made war around the world. We were in Iraq under false pretenses, and we're still there, basically, even though troops have been withdrawn. We're in Afghanistan. We've been there for almost 20 years. Apparently, we didn't pay attention to the Russians or anybody else who's tried to move into Afghanistan. The U.S. controls 70% of the world's arms trade. We spend 60% of our discretionary budget on the military. And the results are we have an impoverished country domestically. That's the results. That wealth needs to be redistributed. And now we've got a problem because we are supporting a lot of soldiers around the world with our, I think, 700 plus bases around the world. And now the question is, well, what do you do if you start to shut down these bases, if you start to withdraw from these wars? What happens to these people? And I think what's been going on for too long, and this is really a very, very deep predicament, is we've been digging a pit for ourselves in these terms that it's very hard now to get out of. And of course, I mentioned early on our support for right-wing takeovers in Latin America, or the Monroe Doctrine, so to speak, writ large. So what I would say to these people, I don't believe anymore. I think people who read my book know this. People who I teach know this. I think the two-party system has collapsed. I talk about that in the book. I think it's a one-party state under corporate hegemony. And I think unless we get a left Labor Party in this country that actually puts forth an agenda, Bernie Sanders had that agenda. I think Sanders' big mistake was staying in the Democratic Party. They've undermined him twice now. He could have started a third party or joined with the Green Party, and not to win elections initially, but to educate people about where their economic justice lies. So, I think working in Washington these days and planning policy within a two-party system is a fool's game.
All right, thanks so much for that. I've got a question from Will Thomas. He wants to know, what's the remedy to reverse this growing inequality? If one mentions socialism, then one is labeled a communist or worse.
Yeah, well, this is an educational problem. But I will say this, Western Europe, at least, even though it has been moving right in ways, has the mechanisms for redistribution. That is free education, single-payer health care, supported childcare. If you move that military money over to these endeavors, you can start to equalize economic inequality. You don't give people checks. And then you raise, of course, pay. $7.25 minimum wage. Dean Baker, who's a liberal economist, said the minimum wage today should be, if it accounted for cost of living, and inflation's been low, but inflation as well, would be $24 an hour. And in my book, I say a living wage is $30 an hour. So moving a minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 an hour by 2024 is just to further impoverish people. You give them a little more, and they're still stuck in poverty. So the way to start to change that situation, the way to redistribute, is through these social mechanisms where you support people. Families are now paying $12,000 a year. Family of four, if there are any more families of four left, are paying $12,000 a year in healthcare and $12,000 a year in childcare. So think about that's $24,000 that could be used for other valuable, important needs if we supported healthcare with single payer and childcare with a subsidy, which is what Western European countries, democracies, so-called, do.
Thank you for that one. I have another question. So do you think it's fair to put nationalism in the same categories as racism and sexism, as that it's another way to establish a superiority of one group over another?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think, and again, something I've said or written about, I think the nation state is the worst possible social system, conceivable. And of course, it breeds nationalism, and nationalism slides very easily into a certain kind of ethnocentrism, racism, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the nation state, look at if the economy and the climate keeps collapsing, we're going to be looking to other forms of survival than the nation state. And I think those forms actually exist in indigenous thought and practice. The Zapatistas' autonomous communities in Chiapas, Mexico, are a good example of self-sustaining communities based on sustainability, not growth, productivity. One of the things I say in the book, I have 4 terms that limit our thinking, which puts us in jeopardy today, and they are profit, property, production, and progress. We think solely within those 4 terms instead of thinking about sustainability. There's a very good pamphlet, you can get it online, coming out of the indigenous ideas in South America that have influenced the Bolivian, Ecuadorian constitutions, called Buen Vivir. It comes from a Quechua word, sumac cauce, which means the good life, but it's precisely the opposite good life to our notion of the good life. It's a life of sustainability, of degrowth, of environmental interaction in a sustainable, positive way. And that pamphlet outlines it very, very well. People can just Google it if they're interested. Buen Vivir.
Awesome. Here's an interesting conversation or question from Michael Hoey.
Mhm.
He asks, are we able to maintain our empire and also help people here at home?
No.
All right.
That's a simple no. No country's been able to do that. In fact, as the empires were dismantled after the Second World War, it is when the British system, the French system, the German system started to develop social sustainable systems at home, supporting childcare, support healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. So you can't be spending all this money overseas to uphold the military it takes to maintain an empire, and the kind of resources it takes to maintain an empire and provide domestic security at home. I think that's Roosevelt's point when he says, we can't live in a state of war. He says we need domestic peace and security. So I think that's the answer. So the answer is no. Empires do not typically provide a decent standard of living for their populations.
So a lot of folks want you to just give the name of that pamphlet again.
Yeah, buen, it's Spanish. It's a Spanish translation of a Quechua word. It's B-U-E-N, buen vivir, V-I-V-I-R, the good life, literally, to live good.
Got it.
Or to live well.
Nice, thank you. So Mario Talamas asks, he says that you said America is a shell of its former self, and then you also said it was founded on genocide and slavery. So he's wondering which is it.
Oh yeah, that's a good point. That's somewhat contradiction on my part, which I will accede to. It's genocide and slavery. It's a shell of its former self in terms, I think, of the promise. Look, after the Second World War, unionization was 33%. One of the big declines in our economy for most people is the decline of unions. It's now 6%. At the end of the Second World War, there was some hope that we wouldn't involve ourselves in endless war after that, and that the middle class would actually grow, even though it was extremely limited at that point by race, gender, class. There was a sense that it was growing. And all of that collapsed. Roosevelt laid out the plan for sustaining a decent life here in the United States. And the Democrats dropped that like a hot potato. And the Republicans never even thought about it. But so I think when I say shell of its former self, I think, and you could talk about other, it's GDP is, as I say, the centers of capitalism, if you still believe in that, are shifting away from the United States. Manufacturing's collapsed here in the United States, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you can say both things if you specify what shell of its former self means, as well as acknowledging that the country was based on a genocide and slavery. Yeah.
I have another question. This is kind of shifting gears a little bit. It's from a colleague and actually a friend of mine from Antioch University, where we were working on our graduate studies together, Sarah Lobdell. Are there any upcoming federal policies that we can advocate for that would help wealth distribution?
Well, we'll see what the Biden administration comes up with, but not in any substantial way. He rejected Medicare for all. That would have been, I watched very carefully. I said, look, if the Democrats will just take on Medicare for all, that will be such a substantial help to American people. And COVID-19 proves that. I mean, it really proves that people without health care, millions of people, even under Obamacare, 30 million people didn't have health care, and the co-pays beyond Medicaid, the expansion of Medicaid, which was a good idea, the co-pays and the insurance premiums were off the marker. So the Democrats reject Medicare for all. Bad sign. The Democrats then, Bernie Sanders said, get rid of student debt. Good idea. That money then could go actually into the economy, right? Biden says, well, I'll knock $10,000 off the top of student debt. The average student debt is $37,500. $10,000 off the top of that is not really going to help people substantially. So I don't see any federal policies. There's the immediate sort of expansion of the CARES Act to stop immediate evictions, to expand unemployment for a while. I mean, these are short-term measures to give people $2,000 extra, paycheck in their pay. But those are short-term policies. Those aren't long-term policies. And so I don't see anything yet developing in the Democratic Party that speaks to the real substantial income inequality in this country and the need to solve that problem.
Can you quickly speak to sort of the differences between the packages that are being provided for citizens in Europe versus sort of what's farcically happening?
Well, first of all, single payer, and that reduces the cost. First of all, you take profit out of the equation. Nobody's making any profit in Europe. These are government subsidized programs, whether they're run privately or whether they're run publicly. So that package is enormous. Subsidized.
Well, I kind of meant more specifically about sort of COVID sort of relief.
Oh, well, I haven't covered COVID. I know that Britain, I've just heard today that Britain has been able, because of its health system, has been able to really roll out the vaccines at a very rapid, effective rate. I don't know what's going on, in a sense, in Germany or the other European countries. I know New Zealand actually had put a cap on COVID. They'd stopped it. They had an outbreak today, so they're back in lockdown with just one outbreak. But they had essentially stopped COVID. Taiwan has stopped it. Cuba has stopped it. Cuba had 82 deaths during COVID. They have an excellent medical system, even though we've been putting all this embargo on them for years and years and years, and they managed to go around the world and help poor countries with their medical system. So there are countries, there are examples. I've given a couple, but country by country in Europe, I can't speak to what the issues have been. It's been obvious that these countries have been much more compliant with safety standards than the United States has been, because Trump, misrepresented the whole situation so badly, and of course created a whole constituency of followers who have now equated giving people spreading disease with freedom, which is made a very bad situation here in the United States. Anyway, that's as far as I can go with that.
Awesome, thank you. So this is going to be the last question for you. The question is from Joan Russow. Mm-hmm. Says the United States has never ratified the ICESCR, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. The U.S. is the only state that refused to adopt the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. What actions can be taken to encourage the Biden administration to ratify international treaties, conventions, and to adopt significant declarations?
Yeah, well,
that's a big one.
It's a big one, and the way the American system works is you put pressure on your Congress people, your senators and your representatives. Unfortunately, they're quite immune to pressures of many kinds because their money is coming from corporate power. It's not coming from the people. I think this is important. It takes millions of dollars to run a campaign these days. So our representatives are detached from the popular will in that sense. So what one hopes for is that you get policy people who will put pressure. But Biden has really, what Biden has done is substitute identity politics for real politics. What he's done is he's appointed a lot of people of color. But these people, by and large, for the most part, are quite, they're corporate Democrats. They're neoliberals, Blinken in foreign policy, et cetera, et cetera. So these are not the people that are going to be putting pressure on Biden to do more progressive things in the world. And so I don't hold out a lot of hope for that. Certain things may occur. We'll have to wait and see. But by and large, the administration he's put together, the situation of Congress, do not speak for pressure in the ways that the person who asked the question is looking to implement.
All right, well, thank you for that. So I'd like to extend many thank yous to Professor Cheyfitz for participating tonight and for all the folks who came and were part of our conversation. Professor, what's the best way for folks to stay informed about your work?
Well, I would read my book. That's a good way to stay informed about my work. It's out now in a reasonable paperback edition. It came out, Routledge published the original in hardback for an abominable price, and I took the paperback rights back from them, and it's now published by Paperboat Press, which is part of a really important collective in Raleigh-Durham, North Carolina, a left-wing collective. And it's a nice addition, and it is expanded. So I think you can get it for about $20, which is not bad these days for a book. You can also get it in the library, of course. I'm at Cornell University. I have a Twitter feed. I'm on Facebook, which I don't use very much anymore. And I can always be contacted through email. My email address is out in the public. It is, and I would try to answer emails. I get a lot, but it's etc7@cornell.edu is my email address. So I'm available.
Awesome. Thanks so much. So to stay in touch with New Hampshire Peace Action and the work we're doing, you can visit our website at newhampshirepeaceaction.org and look us up on Facebook for more about what we're doing in the future. I'd like to take a moment to mention our next event, which is Iran's Reverence for Poetry for Women Poets on Sunday, February 28th at 4:30 p.m. Eastern. And it's featuring the scholarship of oh boy, I had practiced pronouncing this earlier, and now I've totally lost that work. Will, Farzina Milani, and our next Peace and Justice Conversation Series event 2 weeks from tonight, March 1st at 7 p.m. What's happening at the national level? A talk with Peace Action's national president, Kevin Martin. And the series will remain free and open to everyone. However, if you are able to contribute to New Hampshire Peace Action at this time, your financial support makes it possible for us to keep doing this work. So you can go to newhampshirepeaceaction.org/donate to make a donation. And I hope everybody has a great night. And thanks again for attending. And in peace and solidarity, I bid you well.
Yeah, thank you for having me, everybody. And thanks for coming. I appreciate it very much.